Wanda, leave the envelopes on the table and step back.
So they pinned the whole thing on me. Of course they did.
These bank statements never reached the family.
They needed somebody to take the fall, and they picked the one nurse who actually worked this.
Wanda Talich worked without oversight for 12 years as a licensed practical nurse caring for dementia patients in Cliff Rose, Maine. 28 residents depended on her. Not one person checked.
I'm the easy target. I've always been the easy target, and everyone above me walks while I...
She would never set foot in the building again. Within 48 hours, sheriff's deputies and Maine state investigators had served warrants on her home, her vehicle, her locker at Cliff Rose Assisted Living, and the personal banking accounts she had opened in 3 different towns. 11 residents, $560,000. 4 years of forged signatures on checks belonging to women and men whose own doctors had documented in writing that they could no longer balance a checkbook. The medical records the residents themselves could not read would become the evidence she could not survive. Before we go any further, I have to ask, have you ever placed a parent or grandparent in a memory care facility, or do you know someone who has? Drop a comment and let me know what that experience was like. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the kind of case this channel exists to cover. We do not let these stories quietly disappear. Wanda Lorraine Talich was born in October 1971 in Skowhegan, Maine, the second of 3 daughters in a working-class family that had lived in the Kennebec Valley for 4 generations. Her father, Raymond Talich, worked as a maintenance mechanic at a paper mill on the Kennebec River until the mill scaled back operations in the late 1980s. Her mother, Joyce, worked as a part-time nursing aide at a small county nursing home outside Madison, picking up extra shifts whenever the mill cut hours. Joyce came home in white polyester scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and cafeteria grease. Wanda would later tell colleagues she could not remember a single childhood evening when her mother did not have a story about an old person at the nursing home. Money was tight, but not desperate. The Talich family lived in a 2-story farmhouse off Route 148 with a wood stove in the living room, a vegetable garden in the side yard, and a cellar full of canned tomatoes and pickled beans. Wanda graduated from Skowhegan Area High School in 1989 with a B average, a clean attendance record, and what her guidance counselor described in a letter of recommendation as a steady, practical disposition, well suited to the helping professions. She enrolled the next fall in the licensed practical nursing program at Kennebec Valley Community College in Fairfield. Tuition came to roughly $2,400 a year. She worked nights at a Dunkin' Donuts on Western Avenue to cover the difference. She earned her LPN credential in the spring of 1991 at the age of 19. Her first job paid $8.40 an hour at a county nursing facility in Waterville, where she worked the overnight shift on a long-term care unit for 2.5 years. Her supervisor at the time noted in her annual review that she was, quote, dependable on overnights and unusually patient with confused residents, end quote. That note, written in 1992, would be entered into evidence at her sentencing 32 years later. She married a sheet metal worker named Curtis Donnelly in 1994. They had 2 children, a daughter Ashley in 1996 and a son Tanner in 1999. The marriage held together for 16 years before quietly dissolving in 2010 over what court filings described as irreconcilable differences. Wanda kept the house, a small salt box on a half-acre lot outside the unincorporated village of Cliff Rose, on the coast about an hour northeast of Portland. The mortgage was modest. The child support was steady. The life she built after the divorce was small but stable. In 2012, at the age of 40, she applied for a full-time LPN position at Cliff Rose Assisted Living, a 140-bed facility tucked into the woods off Shore Road, with a separate 28-bed memory care wing for residents diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and other progressive dementias. The hiring administrator, a woman named Pauline Reeves, would later testify that Wanda's interview was unremarkable in the best possible way. She was punctual. She was direct. She had 21 years of bedside experience by that point and a clean license. Her references described her with words like reliable, organized, and quietly competent. She was hired in May of 2012 at a starting wage of $22.75 an hour. Within 18 months, she had been promoted to the day shift charge nurse position on the memory care wing, which carried a small raise and the keys to the medication cart. Her annual evaluations described her as detail-oriented, calm under pressure, and consistently respectful of resident dignity. One supervisor wrote, in 2015, that Wanda was the kind of nurse families specifically requested when their mothers were having a bad week. That phrase, requested by families, would also come back later, in a different room, with a different audience. For the first 8 years of her time at Cliff Rose, there was no whisper of trouble. Her name appeared on birthday cards from grateful adult children. She attended the funeral of a resident in 2017 and sat with the family at the church. She brought homemade banana bread to the nurses' station at Christmas. She picked up extra shifts when the facility ran short. She paid her mortgage on time. She took her 2 children on a long-anticipated trip to Acadia National Park in the summer of 2018. By every external measure available to anyone who saw her in passing, Wanda Talich was exactly what the staffing roster at Cliff Rose said she was: a 12-year LPN, a trusted caregiver, a neighbor, which is the part of this story that matters most. Because the people who would eventually be hurt by her did not see a stranger come through their door. They saw the same nurse they had seen every weekday morning for years. To understand what Wanda Talich did, you have to understand what a memory care wing actually is. Cliff Rose Assisted Living's memory care unit was a self-contained ward of 28 private rooms arranged in a horseshoe around a central nurses' station, a small dining room, and a secured courtyard with raised garden beds and a koi pond. The doors at both ends of the unit were keypad locked. Residents could not leave without staff escort. The walls of the corridor were painted in warm earth tones because the consulting clinical psychologist had recommended muted colors to reduce agitation. Family photographs were mounted at eye level outside each resident's door, sometimes with a name placard underneath, because residents in the middle stages of progressive dementia often could not reliably identify which room was theirs without a visual cue. The residents on that unit ranged in age from 68 to 94. Their diagnoses included Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. Their families had placed them at Cliff Rose at the precise moment in the disease's progression when independent living had become unsafe and skilled nursing care had not yet become medically necessary. They were, by clinical definition, people who could no longer be trusted to manage a stove, a car, a medication schedule, or a checkbook. The clinical reality of the unit was documented every single day in a system called the electronic medical record. Every shift, every nurse, every aide, every visiting physician entered observations into a software platform that time-stamped each note and locked it after entry. Cognitive status was assessed and recorded routinely. Phrases like oriented to person only, unable to identify date or location, requires full assistance with all instrumental activities of daily living, and demonstrates impaired decision-making capacity appeared across the records like a steady drumbeat. The records existed because state regulators required them, because Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement depended on them, and because the disease itself demanded ongoing monitoring. The financial reality of the unit, however, was a separate universe. Cliff Rose did not manage residents' personal banking. That responsibility belonged to whoever held power of attorney, usually an adult child living somewhere else. Some residents had POA arrangements that were active and engaged, with adult children who reviewed monthly statements line by line. Other residents had POA arrangements that existed on paper but had gone effectively dormant, with family members who skimmed statements at tax time or did not look at them at all. A few residents had no POA arrangement at all, with statements that arrived directly at the facility and that no one outside the facility was actively reviewing. And several residents, despite the diagnoses written into their charts, still kept personal checkbooks in the top drawer of their bedside tables. Sometimes a single checkbook tucked inside a leather wallet. Sometimes a ledger and 3 or 4 checkbooks from accounts the family had not bothered to close because closing them felt like surrender. The checkbooks stayed in the rooms because the residents found them comforting. Holding the slim vinyl folder, opening it, looking at the printed name across the top, gave them a sense of continuity with a life in which they had once paid their own bills and managed their own affairs. That was the vulnerability. 28 rooms, 28 bedside tables, an unknown number of checkbooks, adult children scattered across the country, a staff member with daily, unmonitored access to every drawer in every room, and a medical record system designed to document, in granular detail, the very cognitive impairments that made the residents unable to protect themselves. The system was built on the assumption that institutional staff would substitute for the protection the residents could no longer provide themselves. The system was not built on the assumption that institutional staff would be the threat. The first forged check that investigators would eventually identify was dated February 11, 2020. The resident's name was Eleanor Mathieu. She was 79 years old, a retired French teacher from a high school in Brunswick, and had been a resident of the Cliff Rose Memory Care Wing for 14 months. Her diagnosis on admission was moderate-stage Alzheimer's disease. Her treating physician had documented that, as of January 2020, she was no longer able to reliably identify the current year, no longer able to recognize her own grandchildren in photographs, and required hands-on assistance to brush her teeth. On February 11th, a personal check drawn on Eleanor Mathieu's account at a credit union in Bath was deposited at a separate bank branch in Topsham. The check was made out to W. Talish in the amount of $340. The signature on the check, when later subjected to handwriting analysis, was determined to be a forgery. Eleanor Mathieu's actual signature, on file with the credit union from the time when she still operated her own account, was looping and shaky in a particular way. The signature on the check was a smoother, more confident imitation of the same shape. $340 was small. Small enough that the monthly statement, mailed to Eleanor Mathieu's son in Massachusetts, would read like a routine debit. Small enough that the son, when he glanced at the statement 2 weeks later between work calls, would assume his mother had paid someone for something, small enough to disappear. The second forged check, dated February 27th, was for $290. The third, dated March 9th, was for $410. They were spaced. They were varied. They never repeated the same round number. They were calibrated to live inside the noise of an elderly woman's spending. And then they were repeated against 10 other residents. The method was the same every time. During routine morning care, Wanda Talish would enter a resident's room with the cart of medications and personal care supplies, close the door for privacy, complete the actual nursing tasks she was paid to perform, and at some point during that interaction would open the bedside drawer, remove the checkbook, write a check to herself or to a payee she controlled, return the checkbook to the drawer, and leave the room. The checks were torn from the back of the booklet so that the resident would not notice a missing page. The carbon copies, when residents had carbon copies, were either left blank, filled in with smaller amounts, or simply removed. For residents with active POA oversight, the forgeries stayed small. A check for $200 here. A check for $375 there. Frequencies low. Patterns unpredictable. The aggregate annual drain on those residents typically stayed below $5,000, an amount that an adult child in another state might absorb as their parents confused spending, without ever pulling a single check image. For residents without active POA oversight, the forgeries grew. Investigators would later document checks of $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $7,200, and in 2 instances, just below $9,000. These were written against accounts whose statements were mailed to the facility itself, where no family member would ever see them, where the only people positioned to notice were the staff members on the unit, who included Wanda Talish. The payees varied. Some checks were payable to W. Talish directly. Some were payable to cash. A handful were payable to a small landscaping contractor in a neighboring county, whose owner, when subpoenaed, would testify that he had performed exactly 0 hours of work for any of the named residents, and that he had cashed the checks at Wanda's request as a favor, taking a small cut, believing them to be legitimate gifts from her aunt. The contractor was not charged. He cooperated. Wanda used the money in ways that, in hindsight, were almost defiantly ordinary. She paid down her mortgage. She replaced her aging Subaru with a 3-year-old Toyota RAV4. She covered her daughter's last 2 semesters of community college tuition. She put a new asphalt shingle roof on the Saltbox house. She paid off a credit card. She did not buy jewelry. She did not buy a boat. She did not travel. She converted the stolen money into the appearance of a quietly successful middle-aged nurse who had finally caught up on her bills. The statistical signature, in retrospect, was visible. 11 residents on a 28-bed wing experiencing a coordinated escalation in personal check activity, all running through accounts at 5 different local banks and credit unions, all with signatures that, under careful inspection, diverged from the resident's exemplar, all during a window in which the resident's own clinical progress notes were documenting precisely the cognitive decline that would make such activity impossible. No one noticed. No one checked. The Cliff Rose administration ran no internal financial audit of resident accounts because resident finances were not the facility's contractual responsibility. The banks ran no fraud flag because the dollar amounts were modest, and the patterns looked to an algorithm trained on credit card theft, like ordinary household spending. The family members who looked at statements looked at totals, not at signatures. And the medical record system, the one place where the impossibility of the activity was being documented in real time, was not cross-referenced against bank records by anyone. 4 years, 11 residents, $560,000. A nurse who clocked in at 6:30 every weekday morning and clocked out at 3. And, somewhere in Massachusetts, a daughter sitting down at her kitchen table with a folder of her mother's bank statements and a cup of coffee, getting ready to file her own taxes. Her name was Diane Mathieu Whitlock. She was the daughter of Eleanor Mathieu, the retired French teacher, the first resident on the eventual victim list. She lived in a small Cape Cod outside Worcester, worked as a school district HR coordinator, and had been managing her mother's finances under a power of attorney signed in 2018. It was the 3rd week of January 2024. Diane was preparing tax documents for her mother's accountant, which required her to summarize the prior year's spending out of Eleanor's checking account. The credit union mailed statements monthly, and Diane had been receiving them for years and filing them in a manila folder without ever doing a detailed review. The bills that mattered, the assisted living invoice, the supplemental insurance premiums, the Medicare gap policy, those were on autopay out of a separate account. This time, because the accountant had asked for a categorization, she sat down with 12 months of statements and a yellow legal pad. The pattern emerged within an hour. Small checks, 16 of them across the year, all payable to W. Tallich. None for an amount that, by itself, would have raised her eyebrow. $200, $340, $290. She added them up, just under $3,800 to a single payee whose name she did not recognize. Then she saw the $7,200 check. It had cleared on October 14th, payable to a landscaping company in a town her mother had never visited and certainly never hired. Eleanor Mathieu had not, by that date, been capable of writing a personal check unassisted in over 3 years. Diane Whitlock did not panic. She was an HR coordinator. She thought in systems. She pulled 3 more years of statements, found similar patterns extending back to early 2020, photographed each suspect check image from the credit union's online portal, and called her brother in New Hampshire that evening to walk him through what she was seeing. The next morning she called Maine Adult Protective Services. The agency intake worker took her statement and routed it to the Sagadahoc County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit. By the end of the week, a detective named Eric Pellerin had opened a case file under Wanda L. Tallich's name and was preparing the first round of subpoenas. Wanda did not know any of this was happening. She arrived at Cliff Rose on Monday, January 29th, at 6:27 in the morning, parked her RAV4 in her usual spot under the streetlight at the edge of the lot, and signed in for her shift. Detective Pellerin's subpoena to her credit union had been served the previous Friday. Detective Pellerin was 47 years old, had spent 11 years on financial crimes after a previous career as a state forensic accountant, and was the kind of investigator who built cases the way other people built ships in bottles. Carefully, quietly, from the inside out. His first move was not to interview Wanda Talich. His first move was to subpoena the personal banking records of every single resident on the Cliff Rose Memory Care Wing. All 28 of them. He told the facility administrator nothing about why. He requested, separately and through a parallel administrative subpoena, the complete electronic medical record for each resident, covering the period from January 2020 through January 2024. Then he sat down with both stacks of documents and began the work of cross-referencing. The pattern was visible within the first 3 residents he reviewed. Personal checks clearing against accounts whose owners, on the date of the check, were documented in their own medical records as being unable to identify the year, unable to recognize close family members, unable to brush their own teeth, unable to recall what they had eaten for breakfast that morning. Checks for hundreds, thousands, and in some cases nearly $9,000, written in a steady, confident hand by people whose neurologists had ruled them incompetent to manage their own affairs in writing months or years earlier. Pellerin brought in a forensic document examiner from the state lab in Augusta, a woman named Teresa Bouchard, who had testified in over 400 handwriting cases across her career. Bouchard compared the signatures on the suspect checks against exemplars taken from each resident's admission paperwork, when their handwriting had been documented years earlier in conditions where they were still competent. The results were unambiguous. Across all 11 affected residents, the questioned signatures showed a level of motor control, line consistency, and stroke confidence that diverged sharply from the resident's own established baseline. The handwriting was not theirs, and it was, across all 11 residents and across 4 years, recognizably consistent with itself. Pellerin then ordered the financial trace. Where did the money go after the checks cleared? Wanda Talich's personal checking account at a small bank in Bath. Wanda Talich's savings account at the same bank. Wanda Talich's auto loan, paid down 19 months ahead of schedule. Wanda Talich's mortgage, refinanced in 2022 with a $67,000 principal reduction, paid out of a deposit that the bank's records traced back, through 3 intermediate transfers, to 4 checks drawn on 3 different memory care residents' accounts. On February 22, 2024, a search warrant was executed at Wanda Talich's house. Deputies recovered, from a locked metal file cabinet in the basement, the personal checkbooks of 4 current Cliff Rose residents and 3 former residents who had died in the facility between 2021 and 2023. The checkbooks of dead women, kept in a basement in a house owned by their nurse. That detail would appear in the indictment in bold type. We are heading into the courtroom now. Before we do, if this case is making you angry, put that anger in the comments. Tell me what you would do if this had been your mother. And if you are not already subscribed, this is the channel that covers cases like this one in detail every single week. Stories like this deserve an audience, and that starts with you. Text messages were not central to this case. There was no co-conspirator to text. There was no boyfriend to brag to. What Detective Pellerin recovered instead was Wanda's own internet search history, pulled from her home laptop under the same warrant. Across the 4-year period of the offenses, her browser had repeatedly returned to a handful of telling queries. How long do banks keep check images? How does Adult Protective Services investigate financial abuse? Statute of Limitations main forgery. Can dementia patients press charges? The searches were dated. The dates corresponded, often within 24 hours, to the largest forgeries. She had been looking over her shoulder for years. The arrest happened on the morning of February 23, 2024, a Friday, in the administrator's office at Cliff Rose Assisted Living. The administrator, Pauline Reeves, had been read into the investigation 48 hours earlier and had agreed to cooperate quietly until the warrant was ready to serve. Wanda arrived for her shift at 6:24 in the morning. At 7:40, Pauline asked her to come up to the front office to discuss a scheduling matter. Wanda walked the corridor she had walked 5 days a week for 12 years, pushed open the office door, and saw Detective Pellerin and a Sagadahoc County deputy waiting inside. The body camera footage runs 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Wanda is wearing her standard light blue scrub top with a ballpoint pen clipped to the V-neck and a small enamel pin in the shape of a sunflower that Eleanor Mathieu's family had given her at Christmas of 2022. Her hair is pulled back. Her hands are at her sides. Detective Pellerin identifies himself and tells her she is under arrest on charges of vulnerable adult financial abuse, forgery, and aggregated theft. He reads her rights. He waits. Wanda Talish on the recording says, quote, "I want to call my daughter," end quote. The detective tells her she will have the opportunity to make a phone call from the booking facility. He asks if she understands the rights he has read her. She nods. He asks her, quote, "Do you know why we are here this morning?" End quote. There is a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Wanda says, quote, "You talked to one of the families," end quote. It is not a question. It is a recognition. Detective Pellerin would later describe that single sentence as the moment he realized she had been waiting for this morning for a very long time. She does not deny. She does not justify. She does not ask which family. She says, quote, "I am not going to say anything else without a lawyer," end quote. And she puts her hands behind her back. The deputy applies the cuffs. The administrator stands silently in the corner with her arms folded, looking at the floor. Wanda is walked out the back service entrance of the facility, past the dumpsters, past the staff smoking bench, and across the loading dock to the sheriff's vehicle. The morning shift on the memory care wing is just sitting down to breakfast on the other side of the building. None of the residents see her leave. The Sagadahoc County Grand Jury returned an indictment on March 14th, 2024. The charges were filed in Maine Superior Court and included 1 count of vulnerable adult financial abuse under Title 22, Section 3477, 11 counts of forgery under 17, A Maine Revised Statutes, Section 703, 1 aggregated count of theft, and a federal sidecar charge of aggravated identity theft under 18 United States Code, Section 102(8)A, that was later resolved through coordination with the United States Attorney's Office. Her defense attorney, a Portland-based criminal lawyer named Marcus Quint, attempted a single coherent strategy. He argued that the residents in question had been confused, that the checks had been written by the residents themselves during episodes of clarity that did not match their progress notes, that Wanda had received gifts and tips rather than stolen funds, and that the handwriting analysis was an inexact science being applied to an elderly woman's deteriorating motor control. The prosecution had anticipated every piece of that argument. They had built the case around it. The lead prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Rebecca Tournier, opened her case in chief by walking the jury through a single resident, Eleanor Mathieu, the first victim, the first forgery. The case began with Eleanor's admission neuropsychological evaluation from October 2018, in which she had scored in the moderate impairment range. It moved through her quarterly cognitive reassessments, each one showing progression. It paused at the assessment dated January 24th, 2020, 18 days before the first forged check. The treating physician had written, quote, "Patient is no longer able to identify the current year or season, cannot recall the name of her late husband, requires verbal cues for all instrumental activities of daily living, including any handling of currency or financial instruments." End quote. Then Tournier showed the jury the check, $340, payable to W. Talish, dated February 11th, 2020. Signed in a smooth, confident hand that the forensic examiner would testify was inconsistent with Eleanor Mathieu's own established signature, and consistent across all 11 affected residents. Tournier did that for every victim, 11 times, 11 medical timelines, 11 sets of progress notes documenting incapacity, 11 sets of check images that the residents could not, by their own doctor's written assessments, have authored. The jury sat through 3 full days of that documentary parade. The defense's confused residence theory died slowly, one progress note at a time. 4 family members testified. The most devastating statement came from Diane Whitlock, Eleanor Mathieu's daughter, the woman whose tax preparation had begun the investigation. She told the jury, quote, "My mother stopped knowing my name in 2021. She still thought she was teaching at the high school. She thought I was one of her students. The woman who took her money knew exactly what she was taking it from." End quote. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 40 minutes. Wanda Talish was convicted on all state counts. The federal identity theft charge was resolved by stipulation. Sentencing took place in Maine Superior Court on a cold morning in October 2024. Judge Helen Boudreau, on the bench in Bath, addressed Wanda directly before imposing sentence. She said, quote, "The residents you were paid to protect were placed at Cliff Rose precisely because they had lost the cognitive ability to defend themselves. You inverted that arrangement. You used the disease as your accomplice. Every charge you wrote against these accounts was, in effect, signed by a woman who could not have written her own name that day. The medical records of your own employer prove it." End quote. The judge imposed a sentence of 7 years in state imprisonment, followed by 4 years of probation, with a permanent revocation of her practical nursing license and a permanent bar from any employment involving custodial responsibility for vulnerable adults. Restitution was set at $560,000. Wanda Talish was transported that afternoon to the Maine Correctional Center in Windham, where she was processed into the general population of the Women's Unit. She is scheduled for parole eligibility review in 2031. Her daughter visits once a month. Her son has not visited. At Cliff Rose Assisted Living, the memory care wing has been retrofitted with a new internal audit protocol requiring quarterly review of any personal check activity originating from resident accounts whose statements are mailed to the facility. 3 of the 11 affected residents have died since the indictment, including Eleanor Mathieu, who passed in her sleep in August 2024 at the age of 84, 2 months before her former nurse was sentenced for stealing from her. This case was hard to sit with, but the next case on the right-hand side of your screen will leave you genuinely speechless. Click it now.